Welcome to the third Utzon lecture for 2013, and I will begin by acknowledging that we are here today on the traditional land of the Bejigal people, the traditional custodians of this place, and we also pay our respects to the elders both past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here tonight. A special welcome to our speaker, Adjunct Professor Diane Jones, and her partner Bob Diasnik. Welcome, Bob and Diane. I'd also like to welcome our colleagues, and amongst our colleagues is the Director of the Architecture discipline, Associate Professor Harry Margalit, and Harry will give some concluding remarks following Diane's lecture. As is my custom, I thought I'd just touch on a few of the highlights over the last few weeks, and there are quite a few, and I'll be quick. We graduated close to 500 students last Friday, to give you an idea of the volume that goes through the place. We also gave an honorary degree, a Doctor of Letters Honours Causa, to Bob Meyer, an architecture alumnus and a distinguished planner. And he also gave the occasional address at the ceremony. Our industrial design graduate, Holly Bajent, has won the Emerging Young Entrepreneur I-50 competition at the Commerce and Creativity Conference in Montreal. Her winning entry, and I don't know how quite to pronounce this, I'll call it VaciPac, is a system for transporting life-saving vaccines to remote regions of East Timor. So that's a tremendous achievement. We have some new research grants. They're rolling in all the time, but this time Associate Professor Sid Newton and Senior Lecturer Russell Lowe have been awarded a prestigious Office of Learning and Teaching grant in recognition of their strong interdisciplinary collaboration. The project will build on their hyper-immersive virtual reality simulation system named the Situation Engine, a good name I think, previously developed by them, and combine this with an adaptive e-learning system. And Sid also is the lead investigator on another successful Office of Learning and Teaching grant announced, and this one is being led by colleagues in mechanical engineering and will devise and implement a virtual design workshop, also using the adaptive e-learning system. And this workshop will provide students across engineering, architecture and other design-related disciplines with improved and personalised on-demand support to meet the challenges of a design environment where inputs are vague and solutions are not predetermined. Those funds together are in the order of close to $500,000. Going back to our students, 12 built environment students received recognition at the Institute of Architects New South Wales Chapter Student Awards on Friday the 31st of May. Amongst those was Manus Lung, who was the joint winner of the prestigious Jury Judge New South Wales Design Medal for his Masters of Architecture graduation project, Platform 870 at Cockatoo Island. Other students' achievements are listed on the website. And finally, one of our alumni, Felicity Stewart, and her design partner, Matthias Hollenstein, were selected by the Office of the City, Mayor Clover Moore in effect, as the winners of the City of Sydney 2013 Design Excellence Competition for the design of a library and plaza at Green Square, close to the city. And interestingly, they were assisted by Felicity's father, Colin Stewart, a friend of the faculty and also an alumnus, and also a very distinguished designer and architect in his own right. So they're just a few of the highlights. It's really my great privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Adjunct Professor Diane Jones will be delivering on the topic of Architecture and Justice, Design Meets the Law. Her lecture will explore the important link between architecture and social practices with a focus on courts and other justice facilities. A little bit about Diane, who may be known to many of you. Diane is a practicing architect and director of PTW Architects in Sydney, and of course an adjunct professor here. She has a strong grounding in design, specialising in heritage, master planning and civic buildings. Current projects include the Coffs Harbour Justice Precinct, and the staged conservation upgrading of the culturally significant King Street Courts in Sydney. Since 2010, Diane has led a Master of Architecture graduation studio here, and in 2010 students explored the concept of a high security court, 2012 a children's court, and in 2013 a multi-jurisdictional justice precinct. Through her work in the Court of the Future Research Network, where she's a co-convener, Diane's Peddlethorpe and Walker PTW studio team is a principal industry partner for 5 Australian Research Council linkage grants between the years 2006 to 15, which have tested the influence of architecture on people's well-being and cognitive abilities. I now invite Diane to give the Utzon lecture and welcome her to the lectern.
Thank you very much, Alec, for the introduction, and to the faculty for the invitation to speak tonight on the work of the Court of the Future in the field of justice environments. And I'd also like to thank you all for coming tonight, especially since there's a ballot and a football game. But I hope to discuss how engagement with this multidisciplinary network allows its members' architect to develop a collegiate mode of working. It's one that moves between practice, research, and university academia. And in that way, we hope we make an effective contribution to community debates about justice. It's a mode of practice which relates to the methodology described by social theorist Bruno Latour. It's cumulative, it's diverse, richly diverse, it sits within the historic continuum, and it's acutely aware of all its inherent complexities and contradictions at every moment of its working. Why justice environments? Chief Justice Bathurst, on the occasion of the opening of the refurbished Banco Court last year, talked about the recognition that the physical surrounds of a courtroom have far beyond their mere appearance. He quoted Sir Kenneth Street, "The courts not only exist for the public, but function in the presence of the public." The Law Courts building was described by the Chief Justice as a physical embodiment of the fundamental tenets of the legal system and existed in the public consciousness as such. He described it as a powerful symbol of justice and the rule of law. During the last 20 years, there's been a growing body of literature on legal architecture. Here you see the covers of 2 significant scholarly books published in 2011. From America, Representing Justice, on the left, on your right, and Legal Architecture by Linda Mulcahy from the UK. In a review of both these books, Kathy Mack of the Flinders Law School described the course subject as similar: an examination of courthouse design and courtroom layouts, of associated images as physical manifestations of law, justice and power, and the meaning of courts in a democracy. According to Mack, each book concludes with a concern for the lack of public engagement with modern legal process. But more importantly, perhaps for us and as architects, she describes it as being reflected in, but at least partly caused by, courthouse and courtroom design, structure and decoration. But like these books tonight, I'd like to begin with a brief outline of the historical context of the courthouse and the beginnings of the Court of the Future network. In the Western tradition, societies first rendered justice under a tree. It was a neutral place, often sanctified by the tree, and the tree represented the connection between heaven and earth. Claire Graham has written an architectural and social history of the English law court, and she notes until the late 18th century there were no custom-built law courthouses. The monarchs held the courts wherever they happened to be. Local trials were held in buildings, castles, churches, guild halls, shire halls. In Westminster Hall, for example, the judiciary competed with shopkeepers. In 1290, they were selling merchandise from market stalls. In 1666, there were 48 shops filling the space between the courts. But in the 18th century, when business increased and last sections of the population migrated to towns, the trend moved to the building of custom-built courthouses with dedicated courtrooms. And the mid-19th century in the English tradition, or Western tradition, is considered the birth date of the modern courthouse. From that date, there was a move towards centralised court design managed by government agencies, and this is apparent in the building boom of the 70s in England and the US, buildings that are described as modernist, utilitarian and brutal. The Sydney Legal Precinct around King Street illustrates the cycle described above. The first purpose-built courthouse of lath and plaster was built in Sydney in June 1796. 16 years later, in June 1812, a new courtroom was built adjacent to the residence of the Judge Advocate. But in 1813, and this is a plan here, this is Macquarie's first plan for a courthouse. The title was A Respectable Courthouse and Town Hall Under the Same Roof. The British government rejected this, and so temporary accommodation was provided in 2 wards of the hospital and later moved to the public school on Hyde Park. In 1820, Governor Macquarie had given colonial architect Francis Greenway directions to design a courthouse on the site adjacent to St James Church. But in 1821, Macquarie handed over to his successor, Governor Brisbane, and in 1822, Greenway was dismissed. And there is an unhappy residence here with the eminent architect after whom this lecture series is named. Or as former Chief Justice Spiegelman said, the experience of Utzon and the Sydney Opera House was not unprecedented. 5 years of interference and change occurred, and finally in 1827 the new courthouse was built. Much of Greenway's design was changed internally and externally. There were a legacy of problems, and over the next 2 decades they tried to convert this shell of a building into a courthouse. And that has echoes really many of our contemporary calls for better consultation with users. So it is in the Australian Heritage Council's Building a Free Australia, Praises of Democracy, John Hurst writes, and I'll quote him here, "Sydney's first permanent courthouse, opened in 1827 and still in use, is not an impressive building, but it is the best reminder of the origins of our democracy, because before anyone had a vote in New South Wales, the judges and the courts were restrained on the power of the governor." The courthouse opened in the second year of Darling's governorship. His instructions from England were to reverse the leniency of Macquarie, who favoured ex-convicts and emancipists. The emancipists were led by lawyer William Wentworth, who had returned in Australia in 1824 with a printing press. Now, this new free press criticised Darling for his harshness and tyranny, but when he proposed a licence for running a newspaper, it was the Chief Justice, Forbes at the time, who declared this to be illegal. The courthouse was also one of the places where Wentworth performed as a public agitator. This happened in the 20s and 30s, and Wentworth demanded that normal juries replace military juries and the colony have an elected assembly. And this was with ex-convicts having the right to serve on juries and the right to vote. But because the British Parliament had banned mass meetings during the French Revolution, Wentworth quite cleverly requisitioned the sheriff, an officer of the court, to call a public meeting at which the sheriff presided. So that happened in the courthouse. John Hurst goes on to imply that because of the wildness of Wentworth's advocacy, by 1835 the judges declared that King Street could no longer be used for public meetings and gatherings. This continued to happen in grand country courthouses, however, and notably this Corroa Courthouse, which in 1893 saw the beginnings of our nation. So for the next 150 years, on too small a site, a landlocked site, and again a lesson for site selection, having space for expansion, the courts filled and overfilled the site. New courts were planned on the Mint site in 1957, but this is at the same time there was an idea of a multi-storey building housing both the Commonwealth Courts and the Supreme Court. By 1967, McConnell, Smith and Johnson had been appointed as architects, and in March 1971 the main contract was let. And as shown by this sketch, this included demolition of the old Supreme Court buildings. But between 1967 and the early 70s, there were changes in the thinking about the city planning and historic buildings. So in 1973, the proposal to demolish the old Supreme Court buildings was being reconsidered by the National Trust, the Institute of Architects, the Planning Institute, the Historical Society, and significantly the Chief Justice then, John Kerr. He wrote an 11-page report and a video, and he expressed his conviction that the building should be retained. He wrote, "Much more history was made at the corner of King and Elizabeth Streets than ever made in Macquarie Street." And then the planners may not like this quote, "Legal precincts are produced by history, but they can be destroyed by planners." So the new Queen Square Law Court building, resembling an office tower really, and you can see in the back of that slide, reflects the increasingly greater space needed by the 1970s for court administrative services. This is referred sometimes as the administrative apparatus which overshadows judges around the world. So it was in the 80s and 90s, in both France and the US, national governments launched major programs to devise new models. In the US, it was led by Ed Feiner for the GSA, and in France, under the presidency of Francois Mitterrand, a renewal program for approximately 15 new courthouses started. But in France, architects were selected on the basis of their demonstrated skills and given carte blanche to design new buildings. Many of these courthouses you'll see later to illustrate points of the lecture. Jean-Paul Miroglio, who recently retired as a project manager at the Public Property Agency of the French Ministry of Justice, describes this as a new phase of lavish architectural creativity. The now Chief Justice of the French equivalent of the Court of Final Appeal for Civil and Criminal Matters wrote that the government gave no architectural doctrine, gave no vision of justice. But that looking back at the program, all the projects demonstrate an attention to the solemnity of justice. They acknowledge the specific nature of judging. They reach out to the town in urban design terms. They offer transparency, but not always using glass. And there's an attention to light. And he describes that as being really necessary so that people who are brought before the court realise that justice is clear-sighted. In Australia, architect Paul Katsieris, who was design principal with Hassels Architects for the Melbourne Federal Court and who now has his own studio, Katsieris Origami, believes that court buildings in Australia attained their contemporary voice in the High Court in Canberra by Chris Kringas of Edwards, Madigan, Tosillo and Briggs. This is 1975 to 1980. It was a two-stage competition, and Katsieris describes the building as the transformation of the Australian landscape and spirit into concrete. Philip Goad has written that it's a benchmark in Australia for vital architectural expression. It deliberately seeks to make the law visible, relevant and accessible to the public. It invokes an entirely fitting sense of monumentality, respectful of the image and the scale of the law. Cole Madigan said, because when you enter the building, and these are shots taken of the entry main floor of the building, one can enter the building and see the structure, services and functions exposed. In this way, he said, it included the visitor in the way it works. The architects described the public hall as a semi-external space and referred back to the notion of the tree, saying it was shaded by the tree. But Chief Justice Sir Garfield Barwick told the National Press Club in 1976, and I'll quote, "You have to watch an architect like a cat watching a mouse when it comes to any specialist building." In a case of a court, they had no idea of what a court needed, what its function was. But in the end, happy with both the aesthetic qualities and the functional internal layout, he said it's an Australian building filled with space and light. 11 years later, these same words appeared in the October 1999 2021 brief submitted by Chief Justice Michael Black for the new Federal Courthouse in Melbourne. The brief said the building should reflect the importance of the system of justice to the community. It should be attractive to those who use it or visit it. It should enable people to observe the workings of the system. It talked about light, being full of light, the courtrooms having natural light, and also taking advantage of the external views. Talked about containing works of art and not just mere additions after the building was completed. And it should have an appropriate dignity, but not threatening. And again, it said, invite the public to witness the work of the court. The court opened in March 1999 and was the first of 4 federal court buildings. There were 2 new ones in Melbourne and Adelaide, and significant renovations in Sydney and Hobart that Chief Justice Black oversaw. On his retirement in 2011, the Financial Times referred to him as the Mitterrand of the Australian courts. He indeed saw his role as a patron, not merely a user. He thought architecture could be used as an agent of change in the transformation of an institution. And for example, when they moved into the new court, the federal court judge no longer wore wigs, and they changed their dress. About the time the Federal Court opened, and this 1998-99, the first Representing Justice conference was held at the University of Wollongong. A need for structured research on justice environments was identified. This really was the amorphous beginning of the Court of the Future, and it was encouraged beyond Chief Justice Michael Black by the Chief Justice John Phillips of the Supreme Court in Victoria, Anne Wallace, who's now a Professor of Law at Edith Cowan Universities, Drs. Prasoona Reddy and Jackie Horan, who are interested in research on juries. Wayne Martin, who was then Chair of the Law Reform Commission of Western Australia, is now the Chief Justice of Western Australia, commissioned David Tate and architect psychologist Louise St. John Kennedy to compile a report on the psychological aspects of courtrooms. David Tate credits St. John Kennedy with introducing him to the key judicial figures in this loose movement, and they include Judge Michael Strong of Victorian County Court. The foundations of the network were properly laid at the second Representing Justice Conference in 2002. This was a joint project of David Tate and Anne Wallace, then with the Australian Institute of Judicial Administration. The key speakers were Antoine Garapon, who's an exuberant French judge, philosopher. He gives Saturday morning radio shows in French radio, and Secretary General of the French Institute of Advanced Studies on Justice. Garapon has been described as a guide to an unknown world, deciphering and giving meaning and significance to the matters of justice. Secondly, Professor Catherine Fisher-Taylor, who wrote the seminal analysis between the link between court architecture and political theory in her book about the Palais de Justice in Paris. And then the extraordinary Noelle Herenschmidt, whose annotated watercolour sketches of courts and other institutions, for example, she's often called to the Vatican, tells us far more than a photograph, and it reminds us that the courts are about people. It's about the solemn and the humdrum. It's about the solemn and the animated. It's about the cleaners. It's about the cooks. It's about the people who serve in the offices. But the wind-up session of that conference in 2002, that was when the idea of the National Court of the Future was put forward as a resource centre for court design in Australia and New Zealand. Since that time, the Court of the Future has grown. It now has formal links with the French Institute of Advanced Studies on Justice. Research projects have been developed with the Cyber Justice Laboratory based at the University of Montreal. Has links with the Academy for Architecture for Justice, which is part of the American Institute of Architects, and through them to the Academy of Neuroscience, which really has the beginning of Jonas Salk and the Salk Institute. Members of the network are based in Australia, New Zealand, France, Luxembourg, England, the USA and Canada. They include social scientists, behavioural scientists, the judiciary, lawyers, academics, architects, engineers, court administrators and interpreters. and Professor David Tate leads that group with unwavering energy and enthusiasm and ideas that we have a hard time keeping up with most of the time. So our activities range from representing justice conferences in Australia. There was one in Sydney in 2010, and the one in Brisbane in 2013 is fast approaching. We assist in running the annual jury and practice research conferences. The 10th one was held earlier this year. There are a number of Australian Research Council linkage grants, as Alec referred to. 5 of them involve the architects more strongly than others, and there are other research projects with colleagues such as the Cyber Justice Laboratory. We also run executive research seminars and tours overseas, the 2005, 2008, 2011, 2013, and there was one in Melbourne in 2009. We also participate in university architectural studios in New South Wales and the University of Melbourne. But most importantly, it's the sharing of knowledge and experience across the boundaries of discipline, industry, or practice and academia. So tonight I'd like to show these activities and the interrelationship by taking some of the key themes that have been raised by the historical outline under the titles or the banners access, symbolism, change, responsibility, and I'll add and finish on the subject of beauty. In terms of access, perhaps the primary role that a citizen may take in a courthouse is as a juror. During the 2013 tour in North America, the Chief Administrative Judge of the Bronx Courthouse, this is by Raphael Vanoli Architects, was asked what he saw as the future challenges for this very large and frenetic place. On a Friday morning when we were there were 5,000 cases on the books. They had 35 judges, 42 courtrooms, and you can see here a corridor that's 4 city blocks long, and people are corralled along the footpath by these metal dividers. His immediate answer was juries, and indeed the most compelling part of the building design is the cylindrical jury assembly room. It sits in the middle of the architectural composition. It's defined by the opaque glass panel walls, and it has an artwork which represents Martin Luther King's words. And the words are, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And that space is also animated by the play of light from the skylights above. The jury practices conferences are designed for a forum for jury managers, judge, prosecutors and other lawyers to talk to researchers, to develop partnerships, to share ideas, and to think about new challenges. For the 2011 conference, the following presentation, I've just included an excerpt of the slides here, was made, and it brought together the data contributed by our colleagues Emeritus Professor Graham Braun from Melbourne and Cameron Lyon of Lyons Architects. The diagrams explore table shapes, suitable for numbers of people, circulation complying with new accessibility codes, acknowledges research on appropriate table shapes for discourse, both consensus and constructive dissent. This is a slide for the Vietnam Peace Conference, different table shapes were looked at, and the little diagram on the side with the maze is by a French cartoon commenting on what it really should be. The jury deliberation rooms of the Victorian County Court, this is by Darryl Jackson, SKM Lyons, show how people are allowed to move away from the deliberation table at times, say during time of conflict or argument. They can sit on the comfortable lounge chairs or look out of the window, but still be within hearing distance of those around the table. And good eye contact is possible. In the County Court also, the assembly room is said to have introduced a new paradigm of placemaking for jurors in waiting. Instead of one large space as we saw in the Bronx, there are nooks along an alleyway which allow people to get away from the mob. There are also ways where you can work so you're not stuck there doing nothing for a day or a whole day. The presentation finished with diagrams suggesting a new model for multiple jury rooms. They're grouped to permit duality of access and use. For instance, if they're not used as jury rooms, they could perhaps be used as conference rooms. They have a variety of configuration and table shapes. They share amenities. It also suggested a way that we could change the way impaneled jurors are treated, so there's a separation from work, rest and eat, and the formal deliberation. Now, the Attorney Generals had representatives at this conference and subsequently, but within a month, had adopted the model for the proposed new jury suite at the Dining Centre. The place that the courthouse takes and makes within the fabric of the cities and towns is critical. So legal precincts and the siting of courts formed a key topic of our last session of the 2013 seminar in New York at the AIA. French architect Jean-Paul Miroglio traced the events leading to the selection of a site for the new Paris courthouse, which has been quite controversial. So he set out how by 1995, and this is a photograph of the Palais de Justice, on the Ile de la Cité was no longer suitable for modern expanded justice system in Paris. There was a severe shortage of space. There are 24 kilometres of corridors shared by judges, lawyers, court staff, sometimes prisoners. You can see the little sketch on the side where the working conditions meant that sometimes young lawyers just had to meet and prepare their cases in a niche in the corridor. Despite opposition, in 2004, the government decided to build a new TGI, which is broadly equivalent to a county or district court. An international ideas competition was held on the Tolbiac site next to the National Library of France, designed by Dominique Perrault. And this is the winning entry. For political and cost reasons, however, that option was abandoned. But after the Paris's failed bid to host the 2002 Olympics, the land set aside for the Olympic Village was available. And it was an opportunity taken by the Ministry of Justice. A number of prominent architects, including 3 Pritzker Prize winners, took part in the 2-round developer-led competition. After 20 months, this consortium led by Bouygues, with a distinctive design by Renzo Piano Workshop, won the competition. I'd like to quote Jean-Paul directly here. He asked whether a distinctive architecture is enough to assert the presence of justice in the city. He went on to say the task is difficult. The Demiurge architect is called to produce a physical projection of the democratic mechanisms of justice, to express a space of community life as well as a representation of power. And this tension between the two conceptions of justice, on the one hand, the powerful state, and the other, a justice system embedded in the communities to settle its conflicts. And he bemoaned the loss of traditions. He went on to ask if it's possible to express sacredness in a building where 60% is occupied by offices, like the Queen Square Law Courts we saw earlier, and only 20 to 30% for public spaces and hearing rooms. And was glass really the only way left to express the accessibility of the justice system? Yves Lançois, who's the assistant manager in the Ministry of Justice responsible for the new courthouse, followed Jean-Paul at the session. He assured the audience that the Palais de Justice on the Ile de la Cité was not being abandoned, that the Supreme Court and the Appellate Court would remain there. And I thank Yves very much for the slides I have of Renzo Piano's design tonight. So it's on a 40-hectare site north of Paris on the edge of the city. It's being procured through a PPP, which is unusual for France for this type of building. There's funding, design and construction, and operation management and maintenance and facilities management. The building will be 160 metres high. It has 100,000 square metres of floor space. There will be 90 courtrooms, 29 criminal, 61 civil, 200 holding cells, 50 judicial offices, 1,000 court staff, 1,000 lawyers, and they think about 5,000 people coming into the court daily. There's a request for natural light in all the courtrooms, and all the offices will have large windows and views. And part of the complex will be open on the weekend for conferences. About the height and typology, which has been controversial, he said that it had been chosen deliberately. It was a modern image of judicial symbolism. It was a landmark for Greater Paris, where there's been no high-rise for 40 years, and its axis is between Paris and the suburbs. During our seminar tours, the ability for courthouses to act as catalysts for renewal or even social change has been demonstrated. This is Jean Nouvel's courthouse at Nantes. It sits proudly across the river from the old town and has acted as a catalyst for redevelopment of the industrial lands behind it, and you can see that in the photograph below. Jean Nouvel has described this relationship and how the design responded to both the urban and cultural context. He said, "We all have our own ideas of justice, even architects. And for my part, I would hate to be judged in a slightly clandestine place." He said, "In the world of justice, there must be a kind of guarantee and a certainty of being judged in public in a democratic and welcoming place." He acknowledged that the strength, however, could be threatening, and the way to mitigate against that was by designing an easily accessible public space. He continued, "I have tried to erase a certain pomp from my design. Beforehand, courthouses had an enormous door, immense steps and columns of excessive size. In Nantes, he says, he's expressed that strength in a much clearer way. There are no steps, there's only a simple slope of the pavé before the courthouse. He believes this is a contemporary version of a peristyle or colonnade, a place where it's possible to stand and speak, a sort of external double of the interior salle des papes or lobby. He's described it as a space that calls out to you, a space from which to face the town. The whole panorama of the town is in fact safeguarded this way," Nouvel wrote. Other critics have described this as being threatening, not welcoming. Catherine Fisher-Taylor has spoken about her anguish in seeing the lobby filled with architecture students photographing and sketching while the locals put graffiti on the walls outside. But time will tell us, I'll speak about later. In Pontoise, Henri Siriani designed what has been called a beautiful salle des papes or lobby. Jean-Paul Miroglio described it as an act of faith, seen by some as an act of folly to use this hourglass-shaped of land, and that the government had trusted the creative genius of architects. To everyone's surprise and delight, Siriani's architecture was light-filled. The building, while quite large, and you see in this photograph here, sits comfortably opposite small houses, and more importantly, acts as a bridge between the streets. The public may actually walk under the building, making it a part of the daily life of many of the residents of the town. Similarly, in Anvers or Antwerp, the new courthouse by Richard Rogers Partnership and VK Architects sits behind a traffic interchange, as you can see in the slides, and its foyer embraces the view of the city beyond. In Montpellier, Bernard Cohen's new courthouse was sited in a poorer part of town on the edge of the main civic precinct. These excerpts from his drawings illustrate the architectural strategy he followed in carving out the edges of the site to integrate it with the townscape. And he described this as being so that people can see in as well as people seeing out. Again in New York this year, there was a particularly poignant address made by Judge Colin Doherty. He leads the Judicial Reference Group for the redevelopment of a new justice precinct in Christchurch. He spoke about the immediate need following the devastation of 70% of the CBD of Christchurch, and that was to maintain law and order and the protection of rights. The new Justice Precinct will be located on a 2.5 hectare site precisely to create a civic presence and as a catalyst for redevelopment in Christchurch. But it will combine a courthouse with police, corrections, Ministry of Justice and emergency services. While it's still at concept design stage, the 3D image caused some in the audience to question the relative sizes and proximity of the police station and courthouse. And this was a similar concern in the Coffs Harbour Justice Precinct here. The site was selected and designed as a government services precinct of courthouse, police station and government offices. The aim was to share resources in terms of vehicle access, plant, and the extremely expensive to build custody facilities. Many months of the concept phase were taken by jockeying for the most important place on the site, and the relative importance of the two justice facilities was questioned, and the need to ensure actual and symbolic separation was always there in the minds of people. Going back to Christchurch, and one of the immediate actions there was to establish a criminal court at a marae. A marae is a communal and sacred place for the communities in New Zealand and Polynesia generally. It was viewed as a great success, the symbolic qualities of the marae having a significant effect on people and young people, especially young people entering the space with a whole different attitude. Nonetheless, the judge just sat in a caravan. So in contrast to this embrace of the marae in Christchurch, in the Western common law tradition, Linda Mulcahy in the book Legal Architecture argues that romanticism can cloud our sensitivity to outdated symbolism. She questions whether we really should reuse historic buildings and whether that just memorialises outdated spatial arrangements with their strong emphasis on hierarchy. But if you take Brookland and the Red Hook Community Centre in Brookland, it was an innovative type of court, and it was established in an old vacant school building precisely because of its historic quality and the schoolhouse's links to the community. Similarly, the Collingwood Neighbourhood Centre, which builds upon the Red Hook experience, is located in an old factory building in Collingwood. In King Street Courts in Sydney, the Chief Justice determined that the Court 1, which is an 1895 Water Liberty Vernon design, should be the position for the new Bales Court because of the threatening behaviour that was occurring in the smaller modern setting in the Queen's Square Law Courts. They wanted to see if the scale and authority of this room would curb that violence, and anecdotally it has. But in terms of symbolism, which is a form of access, how is it read? The Bordeaux Law Courts by Richard Rogers Partnership of 1998 is described by some as sweeping aside assumptions of appropriate imagery. There are 7 of these organically shaped pods clad in timber, and each of them houses a courtroom and the interior shots on the side. It is said that by liberating the design of the courtrooms, it makes the building comprehensible to passers-by. But Marc Saboya, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Bordeaux, makes the following counter-argument. He describes it as a building with no statues, no inscriptions, no interpretation. He says we are told by the architects that the structure may be understood as a message of equality, of judicial balance, of the role in justice in curbing conflict, of creating a level playing field between the weak and powerful. But Saboya asks, is it a symbol understood by the whole nation and culture or only by the architects? And so he goes on to say, while we can build extremely handsome and sometimes functional buildings, the average person in the community is not able to receive the message without an explanation, and wonders how we can make this symbolic meaning accessed by all. And perhaps this is why, anecdotally, the local Bordeaux people refer to this building as the Revenge of the English. Similar observations can be made about a small Courthouse in Catalonia, where the slightly random position of the concrete fins is to suggest books. And then in Chipperfield's City of Justice in Barcelona, where it's said that he hasn't shied away from the themes of melancholy and alienation and seems to embrace that it's strong and prison-like with a relentless grit. But the point I'd like to make here is that symbolism in terms of a spatial relationship or iconography cannot be easily separated from the other elements that make up our experience of space. It's memory, pattern, rhythm, proportions, light, air, smell, colour, texture, materials, craftsmanship, how people move towards or into a space. And that it's probably the cumulative effect of all these elements that matter. This is a problem for empirical research on the effect of the built environment on people's well-being and cognitive abilities, as I referred to. And at the moment, the Court of the Future Network is indeed struggling to find out how to test or quantify the benefits of natural light in court spaces. How do you take away all the other elements? And space is something that is lived and experienced by people. And this is an artwork by Turpin and Crawford in the Darning Centre, which was exactly about that, and where people would sometimes be seen dancing in front of the reflections in the water. During a seminar in 2005 in Paris, a comparative exercise was undertaken. The same trial was held in the French mode, Australian and Chinese. And these are sketches to illustrate the difference. What I remember, though, from the French trial, and you see the judge in the back in the red and Urban, was the French Defence Counsel, he was a leading defence lawyer in terrorism trials, explains how he used his body to counteract the relative position of the defence and prosecution in a French civil law courtroom. The prosecutor sits close to the judge and jury at a higher level than the defence lawyer. Our social scientists colleagues, they work within a framework that acknowledges that only about 50% of their hypotheses will be correct. So can architects really be 100% right or certain? And we're asked to acknowledge the value of describing, when we're talking about our work or showing people around our work, about what has worked as well as what hasn't worked, to be frank. So the Justice Department people said to us, if you're going to ask us to change the status quo, if certain rooms need to be larger or better in some way, you need to give us the justification for this increased cost. Essentially, the major experiments conducted at the Victorian County Court measured the impact of the quality of the court experience for juries and witnesses, and enhanced both the physical environment and the operational environment. That the improvement was greatest when both the environment and the process were improved. But technology is viewed less favourably by some. Linda Mulcahy asks, if we accept that going to the theatre is different to go to the movies, why do we accept the flat screen in the courtroom? And why do we accept that it's a talking head and a torso at the expense of the whole body? There's anecdotal evidence that some members of the public would agree with this. In the recently released book called Night Games by journalist Anna Krein, it contains the observation that the rape victim may have experienced greater healing if she'd been in the courtroom to experience the evident remorse and confusion of the accused. Other colleagues like Paul Katsieris feel that technology will become our master. As you can see in these two shots, one of the ICT in The Hague and one in Montreal, where really one of the judges commented that he could only see the heads above the screen, so do you really look at the screen more than the person? But I think the technological advances might help to counteract some of these issues. We're using wireless technology more, we're using tablets, and we hope that that will decrease the number of screens used in courtroom spaces. But we have holograms coming, and that will change very much the way we design our courtrooms. Perhaps the greatest issue facing the design of the contemporary courtroom is how to satisfy conflicting demands on the real estate of the room. We have an ever-increasing number of lawyers, and the paperwork seems not to have decreased despite technology. We have longer trials, we have bigger juries in Western Australia, up to 18. We have multiple defendants, multiple witnesses. We're acknowledging the significant role played by all participants, victims, interpreters. We have physical requirements for accessibility and intense public interest in some trials. So you can't fit the large number of people who are sometimes called to court in the standard rooms, and there are always spatial and budgetary limitations in most buildings. And importantly, for a court based on human interaction, you can't place people too far away so that they can't hear or see adequately, or maybe even smell. Some solutions are to have video feeds. There's increasing televising court proceedings, and in this student project of 2002, the lawyers are actually placed on an upper gallery as well as the public. So associated with this jockeying for space is the issue of the dock, or the position of the accused in a criminal courtroom. It's a key issue of the current linkage grant entitled Just Spaces. The grant is described as looking at how a jury's perception of the defendant is influenced by where the defendant sits, or how he or she is enclosed. It notes that courts in Australia, Europe and US have found the right to a fair trial can be jeopardised by putting people in glass. In 2007, Justice Bordeaux of the Victorian Supreme Court ordered the removal of the glass around the dock containing a group of men charged with terrorism offences. So when the Bilal trial was beginning in the Supreme Court of New South Wales at the Parramatta Justice Precinct in 2008, and these scenes of Parramatta, one of the defence lawyers contacted the Court of the Future Network. David Tate subsequently appeared as a witness for the defence. He went on to explain in Architecture Australia in sort of lay language that jurors are special because they're ordinary. They can understand what ordinary people might do. They are drawn from the same caste. So if you enclose a dock in glass, you could communicate to someone, any observer, that the accused is different, perhaps dangerous, and not a full participant in the courtroom. Justice Wheely, who is the presiding judge, ordered the removal of the glass, although Professor Tate's evidence also urged reconfiguration of the dock, because as you can see in this slide and in the next one, as if you were sitting in, this is at another courthouse, it's an alcove that sits outside the main volume of the courtroom, further alienating the accused. However, there was very little empirical evidence available other than 1 or 2 studies about the effect of glass barriers in mental health units. So the ARCT linkage grant will test for the first time under experimental conditions if the right to a fair trial can be prejudiced by glass. It will develop protocols for human rights, look at technologies and flexible furniture arrangements. The 3 architectural practices of Katsuyori's Origami, Hassel, the Adelaide office, and PTW will begin an historical and comparative survey of Australian courtrooms this month. And this comparative analysis characterises many of the Court of the Future activities. It's only possible with the generosity of sharing information and frankness of discourse. And this also happened in 2002 when the Chief Magistrate asked the Court of the Future to participate in an open discussion with key stakeholders in Canberra where they don't have docks. We suggested that they test 2 layouts, and one of which is the Canadian model, which you can see here in a very squished courtroom in Montreal, about a V where the accused or the witness sits at the apex. The location of the accused has come up in many of our tours, and each of the tours always has a design exercises where we ask all the participants, a mixed group of each participant, to sit down and design their ideal space. And this is Chief Justice Martin's notes from a war crimes planning exercise. Its renovation turned an industrial area into an extension of the civic city. But when we show these photographs to judges in Australia, the normal response is that it lacks gravitas. In Pontoise, Henri Stidiani has designed interconnecting courtrooms. You can see the sliding doors by the former French Director of Judicial Court Services. Skillful in that he was able to bring together very simply the conceptual changes in the justice process and the accompanying physical environment. And he made the distinction between horizontal justice and vertical justice. Horizontal justice was where you sat around a table on an even footing. The main aim was mediation, conciliation, and the calming of passions. Vertical justice, however, is when you hand down a sentence. And for this, he felt that justice needed to be cloaked in the vestments of solemnity. And you needed to maintain the distance between those who are being judged and the people who are handing down the justice. But he does remind us that the difference to the 19th century is that we just don't mete out justice to litigants who are forcibly brought into the court. Many people go to court now seeking justice. And so there needs to be a diversity, solemn parts and the private, more informal areas where you promote listening and paying attention to other people. The Port Augusta Courthouse attempts this. It was designed by the South Australian Department for Transport, Energy and Infrastructure. It serves a wide range of jurisdictions and the socio-spatial needs of many different client groups and organisations. Of the 3 courtrooms, the Magistrates Court doubles as an Aboriginal sentencing or conferencing court. The round table is used in the Aboriginal court. In Nantes, Nouvel argues that these transparencies between the courtroom pods and the yellow looking out to the city do the same thing as Bernard Cohen achieved to do. For Australia, Kim Dovey, in his book Framing Places, refers to the spatial syntax analysis developed by Hillier and Hansen as useful for the analysing issues of power in architecture. Loosely applying this method to the Sydney West Trial Court in Parramatta and then comparing that with what happens in the Collingwood Neighbourhood Justice Centre by the same architects reveals the issues described. In the Sydney West Trial Court, there's a lot of black. In Collingwood, less so, and people are able to move from one side of the building to the other. We are trying to do this again in Coffs Harbour by taking the public circulation across the full depth of the plan at some points so that people can understand how the place works. This derives in part from many spaces serving dual purposes, like the jury rooms being conference rooms when they're not in use for juries, and orienting the courtrooms in different ways. So universities play a lead role under the banner of change. The University of Melbourne is in the last year of a 3-year program, which has been sponsored by the Supreme Court of Victoria with its Chief Justice Marilyn Warren and Justice Robert Osborne. It says that it seeks to get this next generation of courthouse, and these are slides from last year's prize winner. In New South Wales here, and I have to thank the Dean and Anne Quinlan and Diane Alec for their really great support of this program. We too are in a 3rd year of holding graduation studios centred on the agency of justice. It's hoped the studio has assisted students in understanding their role, and the role is quoted from Catherine Fisher-Taylor as an aware and active participant in public debates. The students are encouraged to find and articulate a design process which works from research and analysis, and to use the elements of architecture and their power of interaction with people in a knowing way. A selection of these student projects from 2012 will be used as a lead session on the 4th Representing Justice Conference in Brisbane this year, because it highlights an area, in this case Children's Court, which has received scant research attention. And so the projects show the potential power of the relationship between universities and practice in the generation of new ideas. Finally, on politics and beauty. Jane Loafer wrote in 1999, it was a non-joke, how many architects does it take to design a federal building to meet emergency security standards? The answer was 0. And she called on architects to become more politically engaged. She said by tradition or temperament, they tend to avoid the political fray. And maybe, to some extent, it's also about the economic imperatives and the competition in our profession. Kim Dovey that same year made a similar argument. He, again, like the French, called upon Plato's definition of the Demiurge, the creative spirit that shapes the visible world out of chaos. And he talks about architects mediating between the notions of truth, justice and democracy in form making. And design practice, research and education need to keep in play with this liaison. So this tension between formal and functional issues in architecture tends to dominate the engagement of architects talking about power and thus injustice environments. This is a poignant reminder of this in a recent Danish newspaper article on the new Frederiksberg Courthouse, whose external form was designed by 3XN. It's a beautifully detailed, sinuous form. But in the newspaper articles, the comment is made that the interiors, which are neutral white boxes of Laminex, diminish a citizen and they feel as if they're only a client number in the system. Paul Katsouris, when he was talking about Chief Justice Michael Black as the Mitterrand of the courts in 2001, was quoted as saying, "As architecture is a forgotten vehicle for the communication of complex ideas." Black's courts, he says, communicate ideas that state, "I am open, I am not stuck in a neoclassical framework that has no relevance to you, I am part of your contemporary life, I am a fair place." So indeed, we believe the architecture of law courts is the very place where higher ideals and ideas should be given beautiful and physical expression, where the sublime, the aesthetic can be found, where the poetic and critical can make a difference to our institutions. And the collegiate platform, the Court of the Future Network, does offer that for architects. It offers us a chance to provide leadership in the debate about beauty and to offer other disciplines a way to see. And its activities also acknowledge that in order to contribute to the dialogue of changes in our society and how architecture might signal those changes, we can't just do that sitting at our desks. We need active engagement with a range of people in a wide range of disciplines and countries. So as we travelled North America in our last research tour, many of us pondered this as we visit places of overwhelmingly neutral expression. So despite the contemporary criticisms of functional deficiencies and maybe extravagance of the French courts of the 1980s and 1990s, we wonder in 50 years' time, is it their refined aesthetic and craftsmanship that will continue to inspire? For Nantes, when the Salle des Pas Perdus, when the idea of bars are long forgotten as a symbol of incarceration, will it really be the place of freedom and strength spoken about Neville? Will the beautifully crafted seats of the Montpellier Courthouse, kidney-shaped, continue to provide physical and psychological comfort? Or the inscribed white concrete wall of Pontoise, which was so lovingly caressed by its architect Henri Siriani, maintain its symbolic strength and ability to convey the importance the court has for those who come before it. Thank you very much.
Questions from the floor? Well, I have one. I was a bit confused by a detail.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
There's a drawing of the Supreme Court of New South Wales from 1962 that was later.
Yes, from Gordon Stevenson's plan for the reworking of that precinct.
And the drawing of the Supreme Court by the later MSJ, it looks very similar to what was built.
It was. So the tower was built, but then the old buildings were kept rather than being demolished.
And the tower drawing is very similar to the MSJ scheme.
Yes, it is.
And how did that work?
I don't know, actually, because maybe they designed it earlier. I'm not sure.
Because I was a student in the 70s, and I remember Professor Johnson,
that's
and
true.
I remember seeing his sketches in his black pen of the precast systems, and
Yes.
I remember writing a
Paper on.
paper on it and criticising it, actually.
Oh,
Liking
okay.
it. I just wondered how, I didn't realise it was an earlier scheme.
Thank you for your talk. It was very good. Luke Johnson from HASL. Have you looked at some of the developing societies and communities that don't have jury systems, yet may one day, saying within 50 years, progress into such systems of justice, and how flexibility needs to accommodate that really significant change in their facility?
I think that's actually happened recently in Japan, and we haven't looked at it specifically, but it is one of the, the process is always changing, and how do you allow for that, and whether you can, how do you provide that flexibility, or, the example of Port Augusta, and maybe you just have to provide, as we all do in other types of building, enough looseness that things can change, rather than saying you have one space and it's going to be everything to all people. It's going to be the horizontal justice plus the vertical justice. I don't think that should happen. And I think one of the shames in some of our large courthouses where there are, numerous courtrooms, that they all tend to be the same. They all have the same carpet, they have maybe 2 different colour schemes like an apartment building, and perhaps they need to have a greater diversity to allow for different people's reactions and process that they might develop.
It seems to me that you've covered many different countries that have different ways of dealing with criminal or court procedures. In Australia, we're primarily adversarial, where you have a judge, 2 lawyers who present evidence and argue back and forth about the pros and cons, and then the judge decides who's got the better argument or the better evidence.
Judge or
but
jury.
in other countries, you have inquisitorial, where the judges actually participate actively in asking the questions and interrogating the witnesses. How did that affect the layouts that you've looked at in various countries?
Yes, I know I whizzed through that quite quickly, but the 205 comparative mock trial in Paris actually looked at those issues, and it was the French and Australian and Chinese. We do have some inquisitorial courts. The Coronial Court is an inquisitorial court. And there are some things from the French tradition, like we believe the Victorian Attorney General has suggested that the position of the witness change from where it usually is on the side to actually facing the bench, as in the French courts. So there is change on all aspects all the time. And that's why some attempts are being made to make the furniture movable or transformable in some ways.
No, I was just going to ask you, Diane. I was thinking when you were talking that I know nothing about the law or anything really, but it seems as though in the 18th or 19th century justice was, you might say, a daunting prospect, or was meant to be, and it was seen fitting that it should be. Are we seeing now that the application of justice should be more, or is moving towards a more conciliatory sort of a proposition?
There is one chain, and David might speak about this more than I can, but certainly in terms of providing spaces, and that's when I mentioned the former director of the French Ministry of Justice who described the vertical and the horizontal was towards more when you're talking around the table and you need to mediate and conciliate. So that's often called therapeutic justice or restorative justice. And so there is an aim to try and design some spaces that are suitable for that, but there is still the other justice where somebody makes a decision and you're the subject of that decision. But again, as the former director wanted to say, that maybe in the 18th, 19th century, you were dragged to the court, you didn't really want to go. But some people now will go to the court because they want their day in court, they want to have their issue heard and dealt with. So that is a change, I think.
Diane, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure this could be a whole lecture in itself, but could you talk just a few minutes about the issues around children's court design?
Yes.
You showed some of those examples.
Yeah.
I just wondered some key differences and
Children's court, for instance, I think most people would agree there is not a good children's court in New South Wales. And on our tours, we visited only two, one in 2011, which was in Germany by Ungas, and then in 2013, this year, to one in Montreal. It was interesting at the Montreal one. I didn't show any slides of that, but they had said some lovely things about it, and the judge spoke passionately about his engagement with the users. It had a youth-run cafe, which had been highly successful, and I was going to, I've told the student who decided to advise that in 2012, yes, there's an example already up and running. But the courtrooms were completely internalised, and everyone was saying, why didn't you use natural light? So I don't think there are good examples, and that's why we've chosen it as a research topic, because it's so complex too. There's those inherent dichotomies in the idea of even children in a courtroom. So it's still a very open subject.
Well, I think that might be it. So thank you, Diane. And I'll now hand you to Harry. Have some closing remarks before I finish off the evening with just the next events. Thanks very much, Diane, for that that wonderful swing through so many things. And I think we can understand the endless fascination, if we didn't before, that you have with courts as the architectural embodiment of the legal system, which of course is a whole realm of history of its own. Speaking as someone involved in small practice, one of the difficulties of small practice is that small practice often competes with building designers, with draftspeople, whatever. And I think one of the problems we have in Australia is that we, at a formal level, I don't think there's enough recognition of what architects do, and what they bring, and the measure of learnedness they bring to certain things. But when we look at courts, I think we understand there are certain building types that cannot do without an architect, simply because of the complexity of both program and of history that they embody. And I think clearly the architecture of courts and of the legal system is one of those areas. So this is a couple of thoughts which aren't necessarily linked together, but just ideas that came up through the talk. One of the things, of course, I guess, is that architecture and the law have a long association. There is a theory, if I remember correctly, that in fact the Renaissance, the whole Renaissance, all its artistic extensions, in fact arose out of a rediscovery of Roman law to deal with the complexity of emerging mercantile relationships, contracts, laws of evidence, etc. So it's on the back of that rediscovery of the law of ancient Rome that the rediscovery of the arts and architecture and culture of ancient Rome proceeded. So we've been intertwined for a long time, architecture and the law. The other point I thought was really interesting was that the changes in the configuration of courts in some way seems to mirror the changes in the configuration of places of worship and churches as liturgical practice changed. Now, it's interesting that we have it within the legal system because, of course,
the other observation was how many examples you had from France and how much effort. Now, that could be a function, I guess, perhaps of the group, or perhaps it's a function, and I guess you can enlighten me on this, whether it's a function of the fact that France takes its legal system very, very seriously as the guarantor of the secular realm, which is where everybody comes together. And the law, in fact, in countries like Australia is the institution par excellence of the secular realm, that realm that is beyond secular interest. And so we see this evolution, this continuous evolution, it seems, of the structure of courts. I don't know what's going to happen in the political realm, but I think it's a reminder of the complexity, the value, and the ongoing historical significance, indeed essential aspect of courts in guaranteeing the secular realm. And whoever's in power at the end of the year hopefully will understand the importance of supporting that secular realm, which you're so deeply involved in. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Harry. That's a very good way to end the evening. I've got two simple tasks. One is to formally thank Diane, which I'll do in a moment, but the other is to just tell you a little bit about what's happening next. So the most important thing is that the next Utzon lecture is the annual Australian Institute of Building address. And this time it'll be with Glenn Palin, who is the director of the John Holland Group. And it's the Australian Institute of Building which honours us in a way by holding their annual address as part of this series. And we've had very significant speakers in the past, and I suggest that this will be on that level and invite you to come to it. But I'll also take this opportunity with a bit of a long run-up, so to speak, to talk about the August Utzon, because it represents for the faculty a fairly important, if not very significant, event. We will use that lecture delivered by Professor Alan Peters, our Deputy Dean, to launch the Australian Graduate School of Urbanism, which is the school that Alan will also direct. We aim high with the Australian Graduate School of Urbanism, or as we will say, probably the AGSU, starting with the claim that we are best equipped in the nation to be knowledge leaders in anything to do with matters urban. And we say that because we build on our breadth and depth of discipline knowledge across the professions that populate the built environment in all of the areas of architecture planning, interior architecture, landscape architecture, construction management, property development, and so on, industrial design. And we also build on our breadth of research around urban typologies, people and place, design research collaboration, emerging digital technologies, sustainable development and design, and analytical engines, but also with our two, if you like, leading research areas, the City Futures Research Centre and the Low Carbon Living CRC research area. So building on that research and integrating that in the Australian Graduate School of Urbanism is one of the objectives, along with our developing historical programs in sustainable development and the Masters of Urban Development and Design, Modern Sustainable Development, and introducing our new program, Masters of Urban Policy and Strategy, which we will commence next year and start to promote with this August lecture. So along with the August Utzon, delivered by Alan Peters, we will have a series of rolling events at 1 O'Connell Street, which is the city campus of this university. And we anticipate the attendance of our city's leaders, our critical people in the built environment, our major players in industry and in the professions, to talk through the critical issues facing us in the future in the design and development and management of our cities. So August is really the next will be the place where we will really launch a series of events to really support our new initiative, the Australian Graduate School of Urbanism. So please come to that, but also don't forget to come to the one in between, which is also important. So my last job, and this time I often forget to do this time I haven't, I'd like to formally thank Diane, and we will give, we don't give a lot of money for our work, for Diane's work, but we do give a present, and what we'll give tonight to Diane is a book called Public Sydney, which we had a co-publishing role with the former Historic Houses Trust, now Sydney Living Museums. So Dan, thank you for giving a brilliant lecture, and thank you for being such a friend of the faculty and teaching our students, and thank you for tonight.